Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniela Caruso. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University in the Pardee School of Global Studies. It is my pleasure today to host a talk by our colleague Andrei Mamolea with discussion by Professor Francine Hirsch and Professor Vlad Perju. Today, by the way, is Giving Day at BU. I see this as our way to contribute, and the speakers today make their own contribution in the way that we most appreciate, which is to participate in discussions on issues of high interest for a lot of us. I'm also particularly grateful to the historians who have brought their expertise to this center very generously this year. So I'm going to start with a few words of introduction, and then we'll have the talk by Professor Mamolea and then the discussion. Professor Mamolea, who is presenting his work today on the Romanian jurist Vespasian Pella, is a historian of international law and politics. He specializes in the late 19th and early 20th century. He joined the Pardee School faculty as assistant professor of international relations in September 2020. His core research challenges the widespread notion that the United States was the driving force behind the development of international law. And he shifts attention to the neglected but important role of Latin America and today especially East and Central Europe. He is currently working on two book projects. The first is a new history of the laws of war that examines how the United States resisted international standards and developed its own set of norms regarding the use of force, the treatment of prisoners, occupation, and military justice. The second book project is a history of international law in the Americas. Our discussant, Professor Francine Hirsch, is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research and teaching interests include Russian and Soviet history, modern European history, comparative empires, the history of human rights, and Russian-American engagement. Professor Hirsch's second book, Soviet Judgment in Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War II, presents the first complete history of the Nuremberg trials. Her first book, Empire of Nations, examined the role of ethnographers and other former imperial experts in the formation of the Soviet Union. Professor Hirsch also has recently launched a new book project on the history of Russian-American entanglement, which will look at international relations through the lenses of economics, culture, science, and of course, international law. We look forward to having her with us, by the way, to present her own work on May 5th at 12:30, so please stay tuned. Our next discussant, Professor Vlad Perju, is the director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy at Boston College and also professor of law at Boston College Law School. His primary research and teaching interests include the law. I'm sorry, guys, just 1 second. Something is happening with my computer. Sorry. So his primary research and teaching interests include the law of the European Union, comparative constitutional law and theory, and international and comparative law and jurisprudence. In 2008, Professor Perju was appointed by the President of Romania to a 7-member commission on constitutional reform. He remains actively involved in the process of constitutional reform, both in Romania and in the European Union. I will add that when I sent him the paper on which Andrei's talk is based, Vlad replied enthusiastically with the words, "I couldn't believe my eyes to find a study on Vespasian Pella." I am delighted to have these guests engage on a topic that is not commonly discussed and yet very relevant to many other debates. Please, Andrei, thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you to Professors Francine Hirsch and Vlad Perju for reading the very lengthy chapter that I sent to them and agreeing to comment. And thank you also to everybody tuning in to this talk. I'm happy to receive and answer your questions. All right, so let's start with a bit of an overview about Vespasian V. Pella's life and work. And then we'll follow this up with a closer examination of his early life, his projects, and how he has come to be, I think, misunderstood by most historians who have examined briefly touched on his life and work. So he was a Romanian jurist who conceived and championed during the early 20th century a system of international criminal justice that was designed to prevent war, punish atrocity, and vindicate humanity's political and economic rights. And this is important. He saw the attainment of these three aims as fundamentally connected and mutually reinforcing, which is a very different approach to international law than we see nowadays with a lot of theorists and historians who tend to place different bodies of international law in competition, displacing one another, frustrating each other's goals. He saw them as sort of mutually reinforcing these three aims: preventing war, preventing atrocity, and vindicating political and economic rights. Pella argued that governments had a duty to prevent economic dislocation, as well as criminal acts that were capable of undermining international order. And to address the latter, he promoted the unification of domestic criminal law and the incorporation of international norms into domestic law. And he did so beginning in 1919, from the age of 22. Also beginning in 1919, he argued for the creation of an assembly of nations and an international criminal tribunal that would play a subsidiary role where domestic institutions had failed to resolve disputes by imposing sanctions, by punishing aggression, and by also punishing violations of the laws of war. All of these measures that Pella advocated, alleviating economic dislocation, punishing criminal acts capable of undermining international order, unifying domestic criminal law, and creating international institutions capable of playing an interstitial role, were considered necessary by Pella in order to address the root causes of aggressive war. So he was a jurist who was very much interested in root causes. And what were some of these root causes? Well, he considered economic causes, cultural causes, psychological causes, and he brought together these different strands, these different causes, into a theory that emphasized the capability of a small, disciplined, and ideologically rigid group of men to use the state to manipulate the public into going to war. This is sort of the final aspect of his grand theory. By 1919, that is to say, by the age of 22, much of Pella's legal thought had already taken form. In a 6-year period lasting until 1925, and through a series of works culminating in Pella's 1925 treatise on the collective criminality of states and the criminal law of the future, Pella articulated this view, basically this project for how to change and reform the international criminal law of the future. After 1925, Pella increasingly focused on putting his ideas into practice, and he did so by popularizing his ideas in the press, by advocating them in professional organizations, where he was quickly able to form something of a consensus among a very diverse set of views, a very diverse professional set of views, and then by harnessing the League of Nations to turn his ideas into law. His ideas made great strides in the public sphere and in the legal professions, but the political support that was required to bring the system to life never materialized, either before or after the Second World War. And so this is sort of where we now reach to the present, and we mark both the differences and the similarities between what has come to exist and what Pella aimed for. Because in some respects, we do now see things like an international criminal tribunal. In other respects, international criminal law as it exists nowadays is a mere shadow of what Pella proposed. So the unification of domestic criminal law that Pella really emphasized never occurred. The sanctioning mechanisms Pella envisioned were never created. And in the years since the Second World War, international criminal law has focused much more on prosecuting atrocity than on preventing aggression. And Pella really saw these as inseparable. You could only really address atrocity by addressing aggression. And what this means is that international criminal law today lacks the focus on root causes and the anticipatory and preventive mechanisms that Pella and his supporters considered essential to international peace and justice. It's much more of a post hoc type of justice than the one envisioned by Pella. Now that we have briefly surveyed Pella's principal ideas, we can focus more closely on his early life, his work, and finally how he has been misrepresented. So I'm going to now go to the next slide. This is a picture of Iași, Romania's second city at the time when Pella lived there, from a postcard taken in 1914. So Pella was born in Bucharest in 1897, but he spent most of his childhood in Râmnicu Sărat, a town in the Carpathian foothills, and in Iași, Romania's second city at the time. His parents had a very important influence on him, and I'm sad that I've not been able to locate a photograph of his mother. It seems to have been a really remarkable person, but I will tell you about both his father and his mother. His mother, Cornelia Pella, was considered at the time of her wedding, quote, one of the most distinguished students in philosophy at the University of Bucharest. His father, also named Vespasian, was a journalist, political activist, and lawyer. 9 months after the birth of their son, the couple moved to Brussels, where they quickly earned doctorate degrees in law from the Université Nouvelle de Bruxelles. At the time, it was remarkably rare for a woman to earn a doctorate in law. And it's sort of sad that we don't know more about Cornelia Pella, because it seems like she was very close to her son. When he was stationed in Switzerland during the Second World War, there's evidence that he brought her with him, that they had a very close relationship. And it's unfortunate that women are so often erased from histories of international law, because in this case, it may have explained sort of why Pella ended up developing these very mature ideas of international criminal law at such a young age, at age 22, for instance. After returning to Romania in 1899, Vespasian the father practiced law, published in various progressive periodicals, and entered politics. Cornelia Pella was active in social welfare organizations, and after the move to Iași, hosted a weekly literary salon. In short, Vespasian Pella's parents were both highly educated and deeply engaged in the reformist politics of the age. Their influence on him must have been considerable. And I think we see this right off the bat. That said, while Pella had these parents who had remarkable training in law, doctorates in law, Pella did not immediately go toward law. Instead, after he enrolled in university, and here you see a picture of his basically his student card, he opted for multiple courses and seminars on psychology, aesthetics, and pedagogy during his first year at university. Pella's writings during this period, which focuses on the power of collective psychology, the danger of fanaticism, and the threat of the faction to general welfare, anticipated in many ways his later work on the origins of aggressive war and the means to prevent it. You can more or less see a straight line between his early interest in crowd theory, psychology, and sort of political theory, and link it to what comes after the war. But in many other respects, however, his early thinking differed markedly from what would come. War, for instance, in his earliest book, published when he was 18, is described as a natural and progressive force. At the same time, there's other material in that first book that suggests things are more complicated. There's, for instance, this very interesting, seemingly autobiographical self-analysis where Pella appears to be torn between a commitment to pacifism and a momentary desire for war. And he sort of struggles to explain how, in the heat of the moment, individuals can sometimes act in ways that markedly differ from their preconceived ideals, the previous ideals. So at the time that he wrote this first book, Pella appears to have resolved this internal conflict by concluding that emotions were largely unmasterable and that war was inevitable. And this book was published in 1915, before Romania had joined the First World War, but he was clearly referencing things that had happened at the time, how masses of people had sort of ended up setting their previous commitments aside and volunteered for the war effort. After the war, 4 years later, when he published his dissertation, Pella would put forth a dramatically different view of war, labeling it a crime. And now here the question is how this transformation happened. We don't know much about Pella's experience during the war and the transformation he underwent during this period. Unfortunately, there's just not enough evidence in his personal papers or his publications to suggest what happens. And this is really a gap that's a researcher in Iași using local archives, examining the lives of people in and around Pella could really contribute something to the body of knowledge. What we do know is that Pella did not serve in the war because of a serious lifelong disability to his right leg, a disability mentioned in nearly every memoir that touches on Pella, and something that I wish I had included much more about in this chapter. It's a very long chapter, it's 17,000 words, but I feel like there should have been more of a mention of his disability because all of the memoirs, all of the Romanian memoirs from the period mention his limp, and especially the most negative portrayals of Pella as somebody who is very ambitious end up pointing to his disability in a way to sort of suggest that somebody disabled should not have been this ambitious, that he sort of was unnaturally ambitious. But it's something that is relevant. So he doesn't experience the war as a soldier, but nonetheless, having lived in Iași during this period, he's very close to the front line. And the views he puts forward after the war are markedly different. They still draw on crowd theory. They still concern basically the problem of discrepancies between people's ideological commitments and their actions in moments of crisis. But on war, there's been a transition. So let's find out more about this first initial publication, this dissertation, which I actually regard as Pella's most interesting work. Usually, the attention is drawn to his 1925 treatise on the collective criminality of states and the laws of the future. As I will explain in this lecture, that is very much a blueprint for Pella's plans going forward. It contains a lot of details, but not much of the reasoning. Whereas his dissertation contains a lot of explanations. You get the sense of what is the motor behind Pella's proposals. And this has been this dissertation has pretty much been left unexamined by those who have written about Pella until now. So nearly all the ideas and projects to which he would devote himself for the next 3 decades can be found sometimes in embryonic form, sometimes in a very mature form, in the final chapters of his doctoral dissertation, Delicte Îngăduite, which is basically translates to tolerated criminal offenses. Although largely focused on gaps in Romania's penal code, the work culminates with a profound examination of the failures of international and domestic criminal law, as well as the social responsibility of government. And one finds here the 3 strands of legal thought that would occupy Pella for the next 30 years. So let's look at what some of these strands are. First, he underscored the need to create international institutions capable of sanctioning violations of the law and sort of acting when domestic institutions had failed to address the problem. So there's this argument that first of all, international criminal law has to be reformed in order to reflect changing morality, especially the changing morality that had happened during the war. It has to address what Pella underscores as sort of violations of the laws of war. And he also says that there need to be institutions in place to ensure that when states ignore the law, that there is sanction. And the way that Pella explains massive violence, extreme violence, disregard for the law is through psychology again. So he says that this is not a particularly novel interpretation of psychology at the time. Says that man reverts to a more primitive instincts in war, and that society is complicit in sort of sanctioning this reversion to more primitive instincts. And it's necessary to have supranational institutions as safeguards to deter states from violating international law, or better yet, from never going to war in the first place by resolving disputes. So he proposes this international architecture that would both limit the possibility for war crimes and ideally prevent war altogether. And he really connects atrocity to war. The way you prevent atrocity is by preventing war. The second pillar of Pella's thought involved the incorporation of international norms into domestic law and the standardization and unification of all domestic law in order to prevent crimes capable of undermining international order. So even when you create an international body of law, that's not to say that states will necessarily enforce it. So Pella argued that because domestic criminal law was more or less already very similar across many jurisdictions, it would eventually be unified to reflect similar procedures, similar punishments, similar standards. And this was in line with Pella's commitment over the next 3 decades to world federationism. But basically, the argument is, in order to prevent domestic crime capable of undermining international order, things like assassinations, you want there to be a unification, a standardization that takes place. The third and most overlooked element in Pella's approach to international justice was his understanding of the social responsibility of states, or put differently, the, quote, tolerated abuses committed by the governing elite. And this is especially fascinating part of Pella's treatise, because it shows that Pella has a sophisticated understanding of the law. He understands that the injustices perpetrated by the elites are significantly abetted by the state of the law. And so to really rectify the problems, you need to reform the law. The law itself can be mobilized as a source of injustice. What's interesting is that he then suggests what are more or less socialist ideas for how to remedy problems, to basically guarantee that those who are affected by economic disaster are taken care of, and this is not just in order to ensure international stability. Although you later see this in the treatise published in 1925, that he connects these 2 points, connecting economic precarity to international stability. But he argues that social justice in itself is worth pursuing, and this has been something that has really not been caught on by those who study Pella. Significantly, this thread in his thought also ends up showing in later works. It's there in his arguments for economic solidarity and for the need for greater economic solidarity in order to create stability and also economic justice. So it's something that has been overlooked, but it's quite important in his work. So these were the ideas put forward in this dissertation, published in 1919 in Romanian, and which would have probably not garnered much attention were it sort of these ideas to stay in Romanian. But in 1920, Pella began studies in Paris. Here we see his student ID from this period, and began elaborating and translating his ideas into French. And at the same time, constructing the transnational academic networks that would eventually launch his ideas into practice. So he was very productive during this period, and he supplemented his existing ideas, in particular with this one study, the most important study to come out during this period, which involved the seeds for his theory on collective criminal responsibility, with which Pella is most closely associated. So this book that he publishes in 1920 on sort of the core and collective psychology in the core shifts his interest from collective psychology of crowds to the collective psychology of small groups. And here you see for the first time this idea that I prefaced in the introduction, the idea that a small group of people, very well organized, are in a position to incite and direct the crowd. What Pella does is he grafts onto crowd theory, which historically had been quite reactionary, had sort of a negative view of the crowd, with a Republican gloss. In Pella's work, the crowd is neither bad nor good, but it's merely suggestible. And the result is that you have to create institutional safeguards to prevent one group from coming to power and misleading the public. Part of his remedies later on include things like prohibitions on false news, war propaganda, propaganda designed to incite war, that is to say. So this study in 1920 helps bridge the path from his dissertation to this 1925 treatise. I want to keep on moving forward because in addition to sort of exploring his theory and examining how Pella put his ideas into practice is very important, and also examining the impediments that he was faced with. So Pella had already written extensively about the duties and responsibilities of states in his dissertation. And so it was only natural for him to extend his argument about criminal organizations that he sort of brought up in this 1920 book, L'Esprit de Corps, and extend it to the international sphere. He did this initially in a February 1920 lecture at the University of Paris, but the theory he developed was not published until 1925, when it appeared as part of La criminalité collective des États et les droits pénals de l'avenir, the treatise with which Pella is best known, and which is a blueprint for his sort of legal projects. Pictured here on the left is the Spanish edition. It has a much more colorful cover page, so I decided to go with this rather than the French one. Because the treatise was a blueprint, it is challenging to summarize. There's just so much detail. So I will just try to hit on a couple of points. For those of you who are interested in more detail, both about the paper that are not included in the talk, this paper is online. It's available on academia. And for those of you who want the publication draft, not the pre-publication, but the publication draft, which is published by Cambridge University Press, I would be happy to share with you the full 17,000 word copy so that you can cite it if you're interested. But what did this book by Pella say? He focused again on the root causes behind war, atrocity, and international instability. He advocated solutions, international solutions to economic problems. He called for international economic solidarity. Pella also elaborated on the relationship between an international criminal court and the League of Nations. He rejected absolute sovereignty and sort of allowed for a limited role to something like humanitarian intervention. And he ended the treatise with a lengthy and very detailed overview of his proposed international criminal law of the future. In the years prior to publishing the treatise, so the treatise comes out only in 1925, which is some years after his initial talk at the Paris faculty in 1920. Now, what is he up to in the intervening years? He teaches criminal law at the University in Iași. He helps draft a new penal code for Romania. He assists the League of Nations as an expert on counterfeiting, and he participates as a deputy in the Romanian parliament with the Liberal Party. And most importantly, for our purposes, he begins to construct the international associations that he hoped would unify domestic and international criminal law, as well as mobilize political support that was necessary to put his projects into practice. He was deeply engaged in politics and a really talented networker. We do not have time to elaborate on these networks, but suffice to say that in the chapter, I demonstrate that these associations were quite diverse, more diverse than has previously been suggested. There's a diversity in terms of approach to criminal law. We have sort of a whole range of views from the conservative Italian positivists to people like Pella, who distance themselves quite explicitly from Italian positivism. What matters is that despite these differences, Pella was able to overcome them and achieve something of a professional consensus around his proposals, at least as far as associational networks are concerned. The problem was not getting international lawyers to agree to his ideas, but translating professional support into political reality. And here the problem was that Pella operated in less than ideal circumstances. This was the mid-1920s, the 1930s, periods of international political instability. And toward the end of his life, Pella noted that in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, a perfect psychological moment when far-reaching and rapid action could have been taken was allowed to slip away. But Pella was not around for that moment. He only really enters the scene in 1924, 1925, when he begins founding these international associations for people who, with other academics who want to unify international criminal law. So the moment was allowed to slip away, and by the mid-1920s, the political support for such reform had vanished. So in the chapter, we see Pella confront a series of setbacks, also interrupted by the occasional achievement. And I will highlight two of these achievements before moving on to sort of the period after. But two of his achievements that are sort of notable is that in 1932, he was able to get the League of Nations to formally recognize one of the associations he created, the Bureau International pour l'Unification du Droit Pénal, as its official clearinghouse on the unification and reform of domestic criminal law. And the second achievement, which is that by 1937, he managed to shepherd into existence two conventions to combat terrorism. This was a sort of a gap that was opened up by the assassination of the French Foreign Minister Louis Barthou and King Alexander I of Yugoslavia in October of 1934. Basically, Yugoslavia was demanding more concrete measures, something like an investigation. Britain, following its policy of appeasement, wasn't really interested in going that direction. Feared that links would have been sort of drawn between the assassination and Mussolini, and basically decided to punt on this investigation by supporting instead the idea of a convention that would criminalize terrorism and that would address terrorism. And here, this is really where Pella comes in, takes advantage of this in order to draft proposals for this institution. The evidence clearly shows that Pella was interested in the effect of terrorism on individuals, including private individuals, and not on the state. And this is something that has been picked up on by some earlier scholars, but has also been forgotten by more recent ones. So this is why I really underscore in the chapter that Pella is interested in the effects of terrorism on society more broadly. And I use this springboard of his thoughts on terrorism to examine his thinking about human rights. And it's clear that Pella did not pursue peace for the sake of peace or security for the sake of security. These were merely the necessary conditions for vindicating the rights of humanity. And it was these rights that Pella ultimately considered the highest good. His campaign against terrorism and war cannot be understood in isolation. They must be understood as part of a broader commitment to protecting individual rights from the tyranny and injustice of war, terror, and mass violence. And I explore this topic through Pella's advocacy for domestic laws against political violence, against both communist and fascist subversion. And I link this to his argument that he makes during this period, that international protection of the fundamental rights of man and the protection of international peace are one and indivisible. In other words, he sees human rights promotion and addressing the laws of war as being fundamentally connected, because war is the most significant violation of, it's sort of the precipitator of the most significant violations of the rights of man, the human rights. They call them rights of man back then, but human rights. For Pella, criminal law was, quote, an instrument for the protection of human liberty. Now I'm going to sort of start finishing off. We're nearing the initial 40 minutes. So I want to take us briefly into how Pella is remembered. He's remembered less for his ideas generally, or for his political work at the League of Nations, or for the associations he helped revive, or for the networks that he helped sort of bring about. He tends to be remembered mostly as a result of a post-war rivalry that he's had. A rivalry is not entirely accurate, but let's say a rivalry. But before we get there, it's important to talk about the 1930s and the 1940s. As the system of collective security collapsed during the 1930s, Pella continued to use his diplomatic position, initially as representative at the League of Nations, later as minister to Holland, to defend the same ideals as before. Despite Romania's gradual drift into neutrality, the telegrams from The Hague demonstrate his continuing support for sovereign equality and opposition to aggression in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland. And you see this also throughout the war. Memorandum left at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of External Affairs, if we want a literal translation, suggests Pella's continuing support for the same ideals as before. In September 1939, he was recalled from his post as minister to Holland and appointed as Romania's representative to the European Commission for the Danube, where he sparred with German and Italian delegates and obstructed their attempts to basically dismantle the commission. In 1943, he was appointed minister to Switzerland in order to facilitate Romania's exit from the war. And his brief tenure in this position was characterized by improving contacts with the Allies. Pella emerged from the war unsullied, so much so that Grigore Garfecu, an exiled Romanian statesman and former foreign minister of Romania, predicted as early as September 18, 1944, that the new government would use him as the, quote, honorable face with which to defend Romania's interests after the war. And this is in fact what happens. He's sent as part of the delegation to the conference in Paris in 1947. And eventually later, Pella also manages to lobby his way into being selected as a sort of observer. Romania is not yet a member at the UN, but as an observer there. And in an unofficial capacity, he begins working with some of his former colleagues, Henri Donadieu de Vabre, Raphael Lemkin, on drafting a convention on genocide, as well as a separate project that he wins a lot of support for, dealing with offenses against peace, basically just dealing with issues of basically broader issues of international criminal law. And it's this episode that sort of leads to a lot of the reasons why Pella, in my opinion, is misremembered. Up until 1947, Pella's reputation was largely intact. There's sort of some sniping from his rivals in Europe that you see in memoirs, but it's only really in 1947 that his reputation first comes under assault. And the source, surprisingly enough, was Raphael Lemkin, the famous Jewish Polish jurist who Pella had mentored before the war, and who is known today for having coined the word genocide during the Second World War. The idea of genocide drew heavily on Pella's arguments for universally punishable crime of barbarism. Before the war, Lemkin fully acknowledged his debt to Pella. This is in his famous proposal at the conference in Madrid in 1933. After the war, however, Lemkin claimed sole authorship for the idea of a crime of barbarism and actively derided the work of his former colleagues in order to exaggerate the novelty and importance of his own contributions. So this emerges quite clearly in his public writings, in his memoir, but also in also some of the sort of the vanity press that he's able to elicit during this period. Now, this campaign had two dimensions. One that was sanitized in public, and historians have already seen some examples of this. There's a famous sort of biography of Lemkin in Harper's Weekly, where he sort of portrays himself as a sort of one man crusade on behalf of genocide. And then there's also this secret clandestine dimension, which was largely defamatory, and which I spend a lot of time in this chapter on sort of examining the campaign, Lemkin's campaign to sort of undermine Pella, to discredit him. And I can't do justice to this whole campaign, but those of you who are interested in it, I encourage you to read the chapter, especially that. In the chapter, I show how Lemkin's attacks on Pella and on his other former colleagues has deeply influenced the history of international criminal law, and sort of has sort of uncritically reproduced Lemkin's self-serving narrative. And as a result, we have really lost touch with who Pella really was. We no longer remember his idealism, his commitment to internationalism, to republicanism. The social element in his ideas have been largely swept aside, and as a result, what we're left with is a caricature of a person who is supposedly committed to state sovereignty, and who's driven largely by anti-revisionism. I go through the chapter in some detail to show that these arguments are really lack evidence, and that many of Pella's ideas about terrorism were really there from this beginning, and were closely tied to liberal ideals, and not to the sort of illiberal ones in which he's sort of molded and made to fit. This is sort of a summary of my work on Pella. The chapter itself is quite long, as I mentioned. It's 17,000 words, and I'm really happy that Vlad and Fran have agreed to read it. And I'm happy to hear your questions and their comments as well. And I'm happy to also address things that I did not touch in my survey of the very long chapter. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Andrei. So lots to talk about. My goodness. Francine, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today to comment on Andrei's fascinating paper. I really got a lot out of reading it. Vespasian Pella is a name I became familiar with in my own research on the Nuremberg trials, and Andrei aims quite rightly to give Pella his due. I think his paper also opens up a very important conversation about the writing of history of international law. And that's really what I'll mostly focus on in my remarks today. Who gets credit for legal innovations and why? How should we as scholars position ourselves vis-a-vis the subjects of our study? What kinds of assumptions do scholars make about liberal versus illiberal states and their contributions to international law? And how do we assess the relationship between ideas and actions, like ultimately actions. Okay, so I want to actually begin with this theme of giving Pella his due. So Andrei, you present Pella as an early champion of I think what we now discuss as the progressive development of international criminal law, and rightly credit with developing key ideas in the wake of World War I that would percolate and spread, taking hold after World War II. Pella argued that the planning and waging of aggressive war should be criminalized. And as you note in the paper and today, that for him, aggressive war included both wars of conquest, right, and terrorism. Pella also argued that the massacre of races, which is what he called it, what would later be called genocide, right? Also the term barbarism was used, that justified international intervention, right? So you argue in the paper that Pella single-handedly, that's the term you use, that Pella single-handedly assembled his approach, right, in the wake of World War I. And I think that's partly why that dissertation is a really important source for you to go back and show the origins of Pella's thinking. And you argue that Pella influenced other international lawyers in Paris where he was studying, and that was a really fertile environment for him to be, where you talk in the paper how these international lawyers were very open to the ideas of foreign jurists at that time, and how he worked with those lawyers in the 1920s to create new organizations devoted to the unification and standardization of international criminal law. Okay, all good. But for me, this really did raise kind of a set of interesting questions. Like, how important is it to you to establish Pella as the originator, like the catalyst to action, as someone who is single-handedly, right, kind of at the beginnings of this effort? Would his contribution be any less significant if it was understood as part of a collective effort, right, as part of a broader conversation? If we credit him for being someone who was able to, I mean, sometimes to come up with ideas is a wonderful thing, right? But it's really hard to get those ideas to take hold and to be able to have those conversations with other scholars and to get your ideas across and to learn from them. And so really that gets to me for this question of like, how do innovative ideas develop and how do they take hold? And then how do we think about Pella in the various environments that he was in, right? So I mean, I know you were talking in the talk right now about how nice it would be to know more about Pella's parents in terms of how he was able to come up with these ideas at such a young age. And then maybe that's some of it, but maybe it's also just his schooling and the people he was talking to and the fellow students and his professors. So that's just something that I just think is a really interesting set of questions around thinking again about ideas and how they emerge. All right. Your paper also made me think about how we position ourselves as historians, right? You show that by 1928, political support for international law reform, including for an international criminal court, had fully faded. And you argue that the United States and Britain had actively undermined international institutions, and that the Soviet Union also refused to play nice, right? Just to kind of put it mildly. And that you argue, though, too, in refusing to support the system of collective security, like the system of alliances in the 1930s, that these three big states, what you say, I'll quote you now from the paper, that they signed the death warrant of the international order. You write that they caused small states like Romania to drift into isolation and neutrality, that they enabled Germany to dominate East Central Europe. Right. At the same time, you defend Pella and his decision to continue serving the Romanian government as it began to collaborate with Germany. Right. And you argue in the paper and today that he used his diplomatic position to defend the same ideals as before and emerged from the war unsullied. Now, I get it. Right. I understand that you're defending Pella against those who have taken him to task, right, perhaps unfairly. And from we see from the critique of the whole Lemkin thing later, right, I understand what you're arguing against here. But I do think that this opens another important conversation about the role of the historian, right? In what cases do we act as like the prosecutor, right, of other states and other individuals? In what cases do we act as their like defense attorneys, right? How do we position ourselves versus vis-a-vis the people we study? I mean, I agree 100% that it's absolutely critical to understand the hows and the whys, right? How and why do the people we study, whether they're diplomats, lawyers, the leaders of states, right? How do they and why do they make certain choices, political choices, other choices in the moments in which they're living? What are the options that are open to them? What are the paths that are closed to them? But what I want to ask you is, how far do you think that we as historians should go to defend or to condemn those choices, right? What do we gain and what do we risk by making judgments, by serving kind of as the advocate, right? In almost in a court of law in assessing what they did. So that's just something I wanted to raise for a discussion and thought as well. Okay, I want to next circle back around to this question of who gets credit, because I just find this so, again, just fascinating to think about the relationships among international lawyers and about this question of mutual influence. And you didn't talk in your remarks today about Aaron Trainin, but you talk a lot about him in the paper. So I'm going to address this anyway, because I just think it's something I'm really interested in and something to think about, because I was very, very interested in the parts of the paper in which you talk about Pella, Raphael Lemkin, right, and the Soviet lawyer, Aaron Trainin. Trainin, who you discuss a bit in the paper, features in my own work on Nuremberg. And I was really grateful to you for the opportunity to really think about his relationship to Pella. I found that really productive for my own work and for my own thinking about Trainin and who he was. Trainin was a criminologist turned international law expert in the Soviet Union. He became an international law advisor to the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg. He was also a protege of Andrei Vyshinsky, who, if people know anything about the Soviet Union, was notorious for, among other things, prosecuting the Moscow show trials in the 1930s. And you write in the paper, and this was, again, so interesting for me, that Trainin was obsessed with Pella, and you describe Trainin and his work as belligerent. I just love this, because as I was reading, like, yeah, I mean, Trainin does write an awful lot about Pella and his ideas. And yes, Trainin criticizes Pella quite fiercely at times, even belligerently. And as I was thinking about this, Trainin found Pella incredibly useful, and he used some of Pella's ideas to support his own. And Trainin had to criticize Pella in order to be able to use him because of politics, right? Because of the politics of the time. Pella, as you rightly point out, had argued that terrorism was a form of aggressive war. And you highlight this more in the written version of the paper, that revolutionary communism or Bolshevism was a form of terrorism. So you kind of see the bind that Trianon was in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, right? That he wants to use Pella's ideas, but Pella is like an extreme critic of Bolshevism. So he has to kind of borrow and position against at the same time. And that's a tricky thing to do. Trianon actually calls out both Pella and Raphael Lemkin in his 1935 book, Criminal Intervention, right? He argues that they and other international lawyers had become so preoccupied with halting the spread of communism in the 1920s, and I'm quoting here from Trianon now, that they had ignored the real problem of aggressive war. Now, as you know, and I mean, your paper just really brought it home to me how much of an overstatement this was, right? It's an overstatement. But Pella didn't ignore the real problem of aggressive war. He just thought about it differently, right? He included terrorism. He had a different definition, a different way of thinking about it. But Trianon's critique of Pella in this work that was published in the Soviet Union in 1935 that Andrei Vyshinsky signed on to as the editor of, right? This was very productive for Trianon, and it actually was one of the things that helped him to develop his own arguments about crimes against peace. And so I just think that when we're studying these different international law figures who are in these different political circumstances, it's extremely helpful and interesting to really, again, think about the circumstances that they're in, like what they're able to say, what they're not able to say, how they use each other's ideas. And that brings me to the most provocative and interesting part of your paper, besides the Trianon one, which I just love because I just fit right in with my own research and interest, but also this relationship between Lemkin and Pella. So interesting, especially after thinking first about Trianon and Pella and then thinking about Lemkin and Pella and these, a very different kind of story. You talk about how Lemkin sought to discredit Pella right after World War II while simultaneously taking credit for his ideas, and how Lemkin's idea of genocide drew heavily, as you put it, on Pella's ideas, and Lemkin, of course, claiming sole authorship while launching a smear campaign against Pella at the same time. And I think just for people in the audience here, I think many scholars are familiar with Lemkin's opposition to the proposal for a new international law code after Nuremberg that would include the idea of crimes against humanity. So there was a proposal for a new international law code that would be based on what was called the Nuremberg Principles that would include crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And as the story goes, that Lemkin saw this as competing with his project for a genocide convention, didn't think both would get passed, and so therefore attacks the Nuremberg Principles. But Pella, as you rightly point out, is involved in both projects. So it's even more interesting and complicated because of that. It's not just a one versus the other here. And Lemkin, well, I'm still baffled, and I'm still baffled by all of that. It's really hard to know what to make of his attacks on Pella. And for me, this is where things just get really weird, right? Just in terms of the language and the vitriol and just what is happening of Lemkin's charges that Pella was working for a communist conspiracy. I found even more unsettling actually, the role played by the newspaper columnist, the DC columnist Drew Pearson that you talk about in the written version of the paper, who accuses Pella, among other things, of serving a fascist government that slaughtered Jews and sent their bodies to the soap factories. Like, that's a direct quote that you have from Pearson's column, and who accused Pella of switching sides to the communists and engineering a shift in US policy against the Genocide Convention. So I guess I want to know more about what you think. This is more, as you put it, this is more than a rivalry. Like, there are rivalries. This is beyond rivalry. Like, how do we even, as historians, begin to make sense of this kind of thing, right? Like, what's going on here? Like, what is this actually about? And why do Lemkin's attacks then continue even after the adoption of the Genocide Convention in 1948, if that's really what it was about in the first place? So obviously there's something else going on, and I just was wondering if you have any more insights about that, because yeah, it's shocking, really. It's shocking. And maybe even more shocking is, as you point out, the fact that many scholars, and I'll quote you back to yourself again, have taken Lemkin's rhetorical cudgels at face value, right? That they continue to hold up Lemkin as a tireless maverick who cared about international law innovations when his colleagues supposedly didn't. And I think that, again, there's so much for us to think about and to learn from here. about regarding the subjects of our research, maybe including or especially the ones we've held up as heroes, right? But regarding them as unreliable narrators, right? Of not taking them at their word about things. And I think there are lessons here too about us just really being in better dialogue with each other, with the aim of creating a richer and more nuanced history of international law, which again is why I'm really grateful to be part of this discussion today, because I think that this is really an important step in that direction of just getting this a conversation going among people who study law in different countries, in different fields. And again, I learned a lot from your research. So this brings me, I have two more kind of quickish points, but I want to get them out there because I think they're also really important. One of them, which I'm also very sympathetic to, is the assumption about the Western liberal roots of international law. You note that scholars often read illiberal motives into the actions of East European jurists and diplomats and liberal motives into the actions of their Western counterparts, and that some scholars have seen Pella as illiberal for rejecting political violence and terrorism. And again, it just seems like we need a bigger conversation about all of this. And I think too, and I wonder what you think of this, that maybe we also need a different vocabulary, right? For talking about states and motives and actors that take us out of this liberal, illiberal binary, which I know some scholars have argued against the binary, but I think we still keep finding ourselves back in it. And again, how do we get out of that? All right. So I just want to end with a little bit of a reflection then on the link between international law ideas and government actions, because you argue in the end of the written version of the paper that Lemkin sought to instrumentalize the concept of genocide to legitimize military intervention against the Soviet Union. And that US wars of military intervention, this is the most provocative point, right? That US wars of military intervention, you say, and I'm quoting you here, are Lemkin's legacy. All right. So those be fighting words for some people, right? So again, just to put this back at you, how should we assess the connection between ideas and actions? Should those lawyers like Lemkin, but also then like Pella and Trainin, right? Who coined terms like genocide, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, barbarism, like whatever it is. Should they take the blame or the credit, or what I want to say about it, for the military interventions that are launched in their name, and then in the name of these terms. So I'll end here, and again, just thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation.
Thank you for those wonderful comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Hirsch. So let's add even more to the plate with Professor Perju. I was thinking about your involvement in Romanian institutional reforms, and I was just projecting into 100 years from now, people making sense of contributions of the people in this room and people who are focusing on the Romania of today as well as the one of 100 years ago, wondering how history would look upon us in a while from now. Vlad, please.
Well, thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Andrei, for the wonderful paper. I am not a historian, so I come with this with the awe that non-historians owe to historians, to people who understand the past, who think a lot about how to think about the past. So I have my comments, as we'll see, are in a somewhat different wavelength, for that matter. But I hope that they're still somewhat helpful. The first one goes to Pella in Romania. There is a lot in the paper about Pella in the world, Pella in Europe, Pella's contribution outside of the country. But there's very little about what influence, if any, he had in the country. At the time when he was working, the other major figure in Romanian criminal law was somebody by the name of Vintila Dongoroz, whose entire approach to things was fundamentally different. That was somebody who had never traveled abroad, who would never attend international conferences. And they were teaching criminal law at the same time. students with names up to M, whatever, would get Pella, and then the other ones would be assigned to the other professor. So a completely fundamentally different experience. Now, Pella, of course, was traveling all the time. He couldn't be around for much of the semester, but, and then when he was there, the accounts are that, he was very interested in questions about, fundamentals, essentials. The other one, Dongoroz, who eventually became extremely influential in the making of criminal law, even after the communist regime was instaurated in Romania. So what's the relation there? At the University of Bucharest, where I studied, the lecture hall is named after Dongoroz, is not named after Pella. So I don't know if this means anything. Maybe in Iași it's different, I would imagine. And I do have to say, I looked it up. Now there's a resurrection of interest in Pella, and I think that your paper comes at such a perfect time. There's a Pella Facebook page. There are books about it. So that's something very interesting going on. So it would be interesting to know, did he have any traction in Romania? Of course he did with, the internationalists, people like Titulescu and Gafencu and those guys. But what about in, what I guess we would call, mainstream legal circles? That's the first one, and that's sort of a small point. The second one is, and this is where you will be able to tell that I'm not a historian. Look, did he get it right? We, at some level, we ought to read these authors and to engage with them, to give their ideas their due, not historicize them, not put him in the context of, at the moment and he was writing, where did they fit? But are they convincing? That's how we read the great jurists of the past. We read Hans Kelsen that way, just to give the example of somebody who is kind of making the same kind of general arguments, peace through law. And so there, I think that there are a number of things to say, and your paper is, again, enormously useful. Some of the work that he produced is really just a masterpiece. It's really absolutely extraordinary. And some of his intuitions are extremely helpful. For example, the intuition that if you are, if the goal is, the rights of humanity, that you need peace for the rights of humanity to come into existence or to be protected, then don't just focus on the international level. Understand that there is a very fundamental part of it, dimension of it, that happens at the domestic level. So now this is a very old insight. Immanuel Kant, when he wrote about perpetual peace, understood this very well. Kant said, look, there are these three principles of perpetual peace. The first one has to do with domestic law, what the countries, what the republics look inside. And then there's the question of what a confederation looks like. And then there's the question of, these cosmopolitan rights. But the emphasis on the domestic side of things and sort of the global international importance of that, I think is incredibly, is very important. And you emphasize it. And that's where some of the questions that I have come. We're talking, he talks about the unification of criminal law. So how does this unification come about? Is it some kind of an organic one, right? Do each of these legal systems of the world organically, through the procedures they have in place, enact legislation that kind of looks the same? They identify the same crimes. Does it look the same organically? Now, you would need to have at least either some general theory, philosophy of history about why everybody's going in the same direction, or at least some theory of politics, where, each of these legal systems, responsive as they are, at least the ones that are responsive, to these different sort of political, social stimuli, they respond similarly, right? Now you would have to believe that there's no way in which their responses get distorted by the political sphere, but whatever. No, so how does that come about? That's an important question. Specifically, there is the idea that it might come about. One of the ways in which you have this kind of unification, organic unification, international law might play a role, right? It might be some kind of a magnet, either debates in international law or international legal binding or non-binding documents, declarations, what have you. And that leads you to this discussion about how national law, domestic law relates to international law. And you very interestingly put it today. You said, look, he understood that he can't just rely on international law. It was very, because nations might not, follow international law. It was very important that all these commitments also be implemented at the domestic level. And there I just wonder, not whether he was right, but whether what he said was enough. I mean, if all you have is if you continue to operate in this binary world of domestic international with nothing else in between, are you gonna get to where he wants to go or not? Because remember, even when you have a very vibrant sort of international, it's still the domestic system that controls the impact that international legal norms have domestically, unless you have some idea of expansion of mandatory norms of international law. So did he work at all on that? Did he write about the expansion of jus cogens? Right? Let's bring all these concerns that he had about crimes of war included in jus cogens. The other possible approach, one that he doesn't follow, is, and you mentioned the George Sell, is to have some kind of an account of dual nature in the legal norms. Again, I'm speaking like a lawyer here, but so people like Sell, they would write, for example, about the dual identity of judges. Judges are both domestic judges and they're also international judges. And some of international scholarship makes a lot, especially during that period, makes a lot about this dual identity. Well, can we think in the same way about norms? But not domestic versus international, because in that connection, the international is by necessity subsidiary to and ancillary to the domestic. But can you think about a third category? Can you think about, maybe the transnational, so that you have a particular legal norm of criminal law that is both national and transnational at the same, like some kind of innovation like that, because it's possible that you might need this third category. You might need to move outside the domestic international if you want world peace, if you want the rights of humanity. What he did do was that he proceeded in this very sort of jurist way, which is you identify a problem in the world, you go out and you create some kind of solution. But as you say, he was very bold. So the solution he had to create was an entire field of law. So, and he does that, right? I mean, his whole thing about the new international criminal law is supposed to do just that. It's supposed to identify this problem in the world where, there are states that are sort of the active agents that are committing crimes against other states. The Russian hacker, right? Remember the Mueller investigation? Remember Robert Mueller indicting Russian hackers that interfere in the 2016 US elections. You do the indictment and then it dies because there's no court that's going to pursue it. It's unpursuable. Well, from Pella's perspective, you create an international court that has jurisdiction over specifically these sort of problems so that they can be prosecuted. And then not just that, but he said it's not just state versus another state, can also be an individual in, carrying the entire force of the state in the capacity of an active, the active element of the actor in a crime. Vladimir Putin, for example, carrying the authority of the state behind him, as well as other, other contexts like, diplomats that abuse diplomatic immunity. Now, the question there is, well, he also wrote, in that context, what about giving states that give support to independence movements in various colonies? He seemed to believe, if I get it right, that was a crime, that was the kind of crime that, for which you needed an international tribunal, but a crime it was. So that's interesting. Then there is, the other thing that I want to say is, so I pointed to this idea of the national versus supranational, to the idea of unification, to how we understand norms. Well, how about the state itself? Can you, in other words, can you get rights of humanity, world peace, if you operate with a conception of the state that he has? Do you have the right conception? You mentioned quite a lot about the importance of, the Gustave Le Bon, and all that conception of the collective psychology, which was very much central to his understanding of the state. But that understanding of the state led him to think about crimes against the state in a way that was very broad, right? If that's how you think about the state, and you think that the state is very real the way individuals are, then the state has reputational interests. And then crimes against the state are a very broad category of precisely the kind of nature, that ended up bringing, lots of people into Romanian jails and, everywhere in the 1950s and 1960s, right? For crimes against the social order. Now, that certainly is not something that he at all would have wanted, right? He thought the whole idea was, but nevertheless, he operated with a conception of the state that might have been the wrong conception for his purpose. There was more, but I will stop here so that we can have the time for other people in the audience to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Vlad. This is clearly a heated discussion. I love this. I wanted to give Andrei the possibility of getting back to the speakers.
I couldn't have hoped for better engagement. These were wonderfully rich comments, and I'm going to do my best to address them. Beginning with Fran's comments. So how important is it to establish Pella's originality? I don't think it's all that important. The part in the paper where I mentioned that he had done things almost single-handedly was with respect to his dissertation. So this is a point where not much has been written on international criminal law. There's maybe a handful of people who have suggested an international tribunal. And it's the ideas of those initial exponents had very little circulation. Their ideas would have not made their way to Yash in 1919. So at least for the initial sort of foundation for his ideas, it doesn't seem like he's in correspondence with the other people we know put forward, in the 19th century, this idea of an international criminal tribunal. And his source base tends to be pretty limited. But I agree that the way that ideas developed in this period is collective. They developed collectively, and it's essential that we have this dimension. Of course, Trinan's ideas on the crimes against peace, clearly there's a link with Pella. With Raphael Lemkin, there's a link between the crime of barbarism and genocide. But also we can look at other people involved in the same associations. So the Spanish jurist Saldana, his ideas of international universal jurisdiction develop through contacts with Pella, and it's not always in one direction or the other. I think in particular the Emil Rapoport, the Polish jurist Emil Rapoport's ideas about incitement. In fact, there's a case where it's clear that Rapoport takes certain ideas from Pella, develops them much more extensively than Pella ever had, and then transmits them back to Pella, where Pella gets them implemented into Romanian law, so that there is sort of this law against inciting war. So I absolutely agree with you. I don't think this is actually a point of dispute that, after he moves to Paris, after he ends up really just polishing, sort of developing, nurturing these initial ideas, it's very much in a collective context, and that he would not have been able to get these ideas forward or accepted by organizations without the legitimacy of Western scholars, of these international associations that help propel isolated academics into a much more important sphere. So I absolutely agree that it's not essential that we vouch for somebody's originality, it's important that we understand the context. I think in the 1919 context, Pella may have been more isolated, but later on he definitely owed a considerable debt to these transnational networks that he belonged in. The position of the historian. This is a very interesting a question that pertains to a lot of what historians do, and especially the writing of modern European history. And I think it's inevitable that we act sometimes as prosecutors, sometimes as defenders. What I think matters, and I think, obviously we aim for balance, and I guess something in our profession also requires us to sort of to invoke balance in order to sort of demonstrate the scientific nature of the field. But I think it's inevitable that sometimes we will act as prosecutors, sometimes we will act as defendants. What I think is most important is that we do so in a way that balances, that where there is, as in this case, I thought, a large number of prosecutors, that there's a need for a defender. And where there's a large number of defenders, there sometimes is a need for prosecutors. So as long as historians go against the grain, I'm okay if they adopt a more critical approach. I think that balances out, and I think that the dangers of trying to be sort of removed, dispassionate, indifferent is not that ideal. It's not something we should strive for. We should try to be balanced. We should try to find the strongest and weakest points in the people in the scholars that we engage with. But I think some kind of position is inevitable, especially on such charged issues where historians do often come across as prosecutors. Sometimes you do need a defender to just enrich the image. So I think this is an important question, but one where some kind of partiality is inevitable, and I recognize that. Who gets credit is another an important question. I think, and I'm grateful for the comments about Trinan. I think I did not consider that Trinan needs to reject Pella in order to incorporate him because of the political tension between the Soviet Union and Romania. That was a very interesting argument. And it's something that I'm going to incorporate in my work going forward, because I do find it very compelling. The strange relationship between them, where Trinan is at once very welcoming of Pella's ideas and at the same time rejects Pella himself. So I found that very interesting. Lemkin, yeah, it's more than a rivalry. What is my opinion? I don't know. It's something that even Lemkin's closest friends and allies couldn't make sense of, and they sort of ask themselves, what is going on here, because he seems divorced from reality. So I'm not sure that I can offer a theory. Something that has crossed my mind is Lemkin does feel like his ideas aren't given enough of a chance in the 1930s. And there is this one reference in his autobiography where he references something happening at one of these conferences, and then it checks out when you look at the transcript of this regional conference that happens in the 30s. But so that could be an explanation, that there's this sort of grudge from this one event that continues on. In the autobiography, Pella is not mentioned by name, but then if you're familiar enough with the minutes, then you can actually trace it. This might actually have been the moment. But it's hard to say. How would a slight at a conference in the 1930s lead into something so large? It's something where we have to recognize just the limits of our capacity as historians, because they're just, when you do read Lemkin's conspiracy theories, you can't really parse them out in order to really get at either something higher, some kind of political theory, some kind of a difference, some kind of intellectual difference, or something personal. We just haven't found the evidence for that. The assumption point, that is very important. Moving beyond this dichotomy of liberalism and illiberalism, I think is very important. And also recognizing that contributions can be made by people with illiberal mindsets. I think this is very important. But I think in terms of Pella, he's sort of in some respects almost sort of he is in many ways liberalism and the embodiment of liberalism to a point that you can say this is to a fault, to the fact that he sort of ignores certain elements that would have not been ignored by people who were not so committed to liberalism. So I think I agree that we should move beyond this dichotomy, but I think that in the case of Pella specifically, he seems to have been wedded to the idea that you can't embrace violence, political violence under any means. You can't have any form of affirmative action. He was almost didn't come close to classical liberalism, because at least he had these ideas about the economy that were a bit more developed. But in many respects, he seems like a typical liberal of the period. But I agree in general that we should strive for a different vocabulary and for a more sophisticated way of looking at politics during this period. The most controversial thing I wrote in the paper was about linking Lemkin to the way that he's been used by proponents of humanitarian intervention. And I guess here I'll defend myself by saying I'm not the only one to make this link. There's Dirk Moses has a book out recently. He's a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I recommend that book to those watching. And he also makes this link about how Lemkin has been instrumentalized, and a certain idea of Holocaust memory has also been instrumentalized in contemporary politics to legitimate more war. Whether Lemkin is personally to blame is a tough question, but he did allow himself to be enlisted in very similar campaigns during the 1950s, which suggests that it's not that he's being his image and his memory is being misused, but it's being used in a way that was consistent with Lemkin's actions during that period. There's so much more here in Fran's comments to comment on, to engage with. I hope we can do more of this in the coming weeks, in the coming months. I'll try to do my best to also address Vlad's very interesting questions. Dongoroz. So I wonder whether we're actually both going on the same source, because I did find this memoir of a student who studied with Pella in the 1930s. And she ended up in Pella's section. And he says, while Dongoroz was there all the time, Pella was often just focused, teaching the theory, and then going off to The Hague and leaving his teaching assistant to teach the rest of the course. And it was very he's sort of a person that the students admired, but he wasn't the most accessible person. So I wonder, this might explain that he is oftentimes more at home in these international circles. Even after he ends up being exiled in the United States, when you see some of these memoirs of who the people Pella is hanging out with at dinner parties in New York City, it's seldom Romanians. It's mostly the French-speaking community associated with basically the French University of New York, which was a component of the New School. And it seems like he's to some extent much more comfortable in and around a Francophone community of diplomats than he is with Romanians. Also, in his intellectual formation, it seems like the year that he spends in Paris with Émile Garçon and others is much more important for the way that his work develops, his sociological approach to the law, than anything he experiences in Iași. So he might just not be that influential in Romania, because to some extent his ideas and his politics are not that Romanian. It's something that I tried to get more of a sense of, what was his impact. I know that he is responsible for having, in the revisions of Romania's penal code, there are certain articles that you can directly trace to him, including this idea that in certain cases of political violence, you should not allow for the immunities normally afforded to political crime. So you can see his role in eroding that, and you touch a bit on that at the end of your comments. So I'm going to connect with that as well. Did he get things right? These are big questions, and in fact, they sort of point in a different direction than the one that Francine wants to take me, because it means here we do come in as prosecutor, as somebody who is judging Pella. And I'm going to try to address these. I think if I was more of a legal theorist and less of a historian, I would have had a better chance at answering some of these. So I'm going to try to get them again. If the goal is the rights, Right. So this is basically about the dichotomy between international law and domestic law. Do we need to go beyond it in order to really ensure international peace, human rights, the things that Pella strove for. I'm trying to find more of Pella's writings on World Federation to get a sense where the connecting point would be. I think that might shed some light on this, but it's true that he still operates, at least in all of his legal writings, in a world that is made up of states. So he's simultaneously arguing for federation and at the same time arguing for independent states, and he doesn't ever really resolve the contradiction. Maybe he resolves this contradiction in the late 40s, early 50s. I haven't gotten his writings on World Federation from that period. I'd be interested. Does he talk about Yuskogans norms? This is actually something where he does mention something like it, that there are certain norms out there that every state has a duty to prosecute. And in the dissertation, it seems like this is actually all norms, and that he's heading in the direction where all norms are Yuskogans norms, which is remarkable. But and I'm going to turn now to my chapter to get this, in the 1925 work, it's a bit more restrained, and he sort of really underscores certain norms that are can be prosecuted by any state that have sort of Yuskogans norm status. And this is piracy, of course, the traditional one, the trafficking of drugs, women and children, as well as the crimes of barbarism and vandalism, which are precursors to the crimes of genocide. So these are sort of the norms that he sees as having Yuskogans status. But there's also hints in there that everything is becoming Yuskogans, that basically he does see domestic criminal systems becoming uniform and joining, and when that happens, you will really not have to worry about these questions because any crime will be able to be prosecuted anywhere. Now, what is the underlying theory, legal or political, for this unification? It's hard to tell. He basically just says, just like an art object or invention ends up being adopted by one civilization after another, so too will legal mechanisms be adopted and spread. And here again, you get this hint of a world federationism. But he didn't elaborate on this, at least in his legal writings. And his popular writings, I've had trouble finding. So hopefully at some point someone will answer this question. These are all important questions, but I feel like in every case I'm answering sort of, we just don't know enough. We just don't know enough. The support for colonial movements. This is definitely an oversight. Although he is not a champion of state sovereignty, he doesn't seem to think about the idea that force will sometimes be necessary for liberation. That there's such a thing as wars that are necessary for defending human rights. Apart from the idea of a humanitarian intervention in cases of things like genocide, he doesn't seem to consider wars of liberation and support for wars of liberation. He assumes that will always be something that just disturbs the peace, and he doesn't really have a solution out there for people who are trying to overthrow empire. There isn't much in the way of Pella's writings on empire, and this is a bit of a gap. In terms of the last point about his idea of the state and how he thinks about crimes against state, here I'm not sure that we are entirely in agreement. I think that already by the 1920s, I see Pella being skeptical of the state, connecting the state to militarism and authoritarianism. And that's why, unlike most French Republicans who put a lot of emphasis on the emancipatory power of the state, he begins shifting and saying it's not the state, it's politics, it's public power. So it's one of the things where he shifts power from the state somewhere to the parliament or to something that is an active process, something that is different and separate from the state. And I think as a result, what he is concerned about when he does things like advocate the criminalization of certain types of incitement, it's less about the effects on the state than on society. And this is sort of a distinction that I've been trying to tease out. You find it there in the writings. but something that I think I probably need to tease out more in future research when I come back to this. I noted in a footnote that there needs to be more research on Pella's failed proposal for more stringent laws on incitement. There's a sort of a little crisis in 1926, 1927, when there's basically this outpouring of criticism, and it's the whole project is sort of rejected. There also needs to be more research, I think, in the law so there's martial laws imposed in Romania and during various periods in the interwar period, and this is used to sort of sometimes silence criticism of the government, but also incitement of violence. And I think we need to do a better, scholars in general need to do a better job of addressing this, but I don't think that Pella is necessarily going in the direction where he fetishizes the state. I think he tries to move away from that. But it's something where I agree that more research needs to be done, and I can see that potentially a future scholar might end up showing that maybe Pella's statements, where he emphasizes the role of society, were just a cover for really arguments that were aimed at protecting the state. So it is complicated, but I've tried to make the claim that in his proposals, when it comes to talking about terrorism, when he talks about political violence, he is interested in defending society, not the state, and that he distinguishes between the state and sort of political authority as being separate things, connecting political authority not entirely within the state, but also outside of the state. These were very fruitful questions, and I'm very glad to have had you as panelists. You both did an excellent job.
We are out of time, but I wanted to say one thing. I mean, like Vlad, I'm not a historian, and therefore I feel free to breach all the disciplinary rules that you have to comply with. Unlike Vlad, I'm not a legal theorist, but there's something I wanted to add here. With my students, we're going through a number of contemporary issues in EU law and like hot issues. And I must say that you hit through the work of Pella on a few fundamental points, really critical points. One is corporate social responsibility. The other one is the need for economic solidarity, think COVID rescue funds. And the third thing is the necessity to coordinate the criminal law of the member states, which brings us to the current debate on the European arrest warrant, a mechanism that should facilitate extraditions from one European country to the other and doesn't always work well. Now, what is interesting to me to point out here is that we can point the origin of these debates we can trace them back to somebody from Romania, okay, to a Romanian jurist. This is essential to me because I think it's part of the critical project of rewriting legal history in such a way that puts emphasis on the contribution of the semi-periphery, to use a word that sometimes is indicated to mention states who are not at the center of contemporary debates and yet should have been if history had been more generous to them. It's important to me to bring the contribution of Central and Eastern European legal history to the thinking on contemporary issues that are so relevant. So thank you very much for doing that. It's particularly interesting because in particular in the discussion on the coordination of state criminal laws in the context of the arrest warrant, very recent cases have cast doubt onto the ability of certain Eastern European states to carry and understand punishment in a way that is acceptable in other states of Europe. It is particularly important to me to have had this conversation today and to have unearthed this kind of genealogy in very deep philosophical, historical thinking about justice, criminal justice, and shared responsibility of state and international institutions. So thank you very much. It's been incredibly meaningful, and I look forward to the continuation. I'm so delighted that Zoom allows us to have these events in spite of everything. Thank you, guys. This will belong in our library in video format, and we'll go back to it many times. Thank you.